Right, let's make a start. A very warm welcome, everyone, to this Active Ingredients webinar. My name's Andre Tomlin from the Mental Elf, and I'm your host today. And this webinar is brought to you by the Wellcome Trust Mental Health Priority Area and the Mental Elf. And it's talking about youth mental health research. I'm here today with my colleague, Laura Hemming, who's going to be live tweeting from the Mental Elf. And the hashtag for this meeting is Active Ingredients MH. Just paste that in the chat for anyone here in the webinar. Feel free to tweet about the meeting. Tell us what you think. So welcome to people in the webinar. We've got about 120 people so far in this Zoom webinar. And welcome also to people that are watching on YouTube or following on social media. Do say hello. If you're here in the webinar, post a message into the chat. Thanks everyone who's done that so far. It's great to see. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can tweet us or you can post a comment. We'll try and get your comments and questions into the webinar. We'll try and keep an eye on those. So we're just going to start with a quick poll. We're quite interested in knowing who's here in this webinar. So please tell us if you are a patient or carer or clinician or researcher or other. We expect most of you to be researchers, but we'll just have a look and see. Okay, so most of you have completed that now. Thank you very much. Yeah, so we've got 70% in the audience who are researchers, 25% who are other, so all sorts of various things. We've got one person who identifies primarily as a patient or carer here in the audience. That's great, welcome, and a clinician. So yeah, this meeting is primarily for mental health researchers, so that's great that we've got our target audience represented. So yeah, just quickly what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about active ingredients. And when we say active ingredients, what we mean is the aspects of interventions that really make a difference to prevent or treat or manage anxiety or depression in young people. When we say young people, we mean people aged 14 to 24. And we're really interested in this across the world. We're going to talk about involving young people with lived experience in research and why this is important. And we're also going to touch on how we kind of foster interaction across mental health silos. So getting, traditionally disparate research disciplines to work together. That, after all, is a really important thing for the future of mental health science. So we're going to describe some of the projects that have been commissioned by the Wellcome Trust Mental Health Priority Area in 2022. We've got a set of short talks that are going to be given on some of those projects. Some of the researchers are here in person in the webinar, and some of them have recorded their talks in advance. We're going to be talking about how those reviews involved young people in their work, and we're also going to be looking at the findings and implications of those reviews. And then in just over an hour, towards the end of the webinar, we're going to also have a talk from Kat Sebastian, who's the evidence lead at the Mental Health Priority Area at Wellcome. And Kat is going to be announcing the 2021 Active Ingredients Commission that launched last week and giving a talk on research funding that is now available for new active ingredients to be investigated. So stick around for that towards the end. I'll just say in advance, PDF copies of speaker slides will be shared afterwards. So you'll get copies of those if you registered via Eventbrite. We'll send out an email. And this webinar will be available on the Mental Health YouTube channel straight after the event. So you can watch again if you need to. So do carry on introducing yourselves in the chat. Feel free to use the Zoom Q&A if you have a question for any of our speakers. And we're going to start with two presentations from Wellcome Lived Experience consultants. Really pleased that Grace Gatera from Rwanda and Sharon Singh, who's joining us from Canada, are here to present their own perspective on active ingredients, to talk a bit about the work that they've already done over the last few months, and just to put lived experience front and center in this discussion. Why is it important that we involve young people in research about young people? So I'm going to start by asking Grace Katera to speak a little bit about that. Thank you, Grace.
Thank you so much, Andre. Because of connectivity issues, I'm going to my camera. I hope that's all right. My name is Grace Katera, and I'm a lived experience consultant, working in the lived experience department at the Wellcome Trust. I have a great boss, shout out Kate. So I got to know the Wellcome Trust as early as January 2020. And one of the very first projects that I worked on was what was then called the core components and what is now called the active ingredients. And so I'm really grateful to the Wellcome Trust. They were very serious about involving lived experience from the very beginning of it. As myself and another young leader named Josiah Tuala Mali'i were involved in even in selecting what core components could be reviewed first or could be researched first. So that's the first thing I did when I joined Wellcome, and I remained completely involved in the process from selecting to reviewing the RFP to selecting what teams and as well as to speaking and holding workshops with the teams that were selected for them to better understand lived experience. And so from the very beginning, I think Wellcome was very, very serious about involving lived experience at the center of it all. And they've continued to showcase that through everything. Even now, as I speak, I'm involved in the second Active Ingredients Commission, but not only me, but also other lived experience consultants that are part of it. This is important. Why? Because lived experience has to guide research. Lived experience has to be at the center of research. All of us have lived experience, and all of us know that when we engage lived experience in our very core of the work that we do, it's much better for it. I know that other researchers here can attest to it. When they involved lived experience, it completely transformed the quality of the work that they were doing. And that's because, it's important to do research and it's important to have evidence, but it's also important to have, to start from what people are actually feeling, from what people are actually experiencing, from the knowledge that comes from having lived through it. And that's why I'm such an active ingredients evangelist, because this is what the active ingredients is calling for from the beginning to the end. I will end this with talking about my key recommendations. Some of the recommendations from working on the active ingredients commissions that I've seen among other young leaders as well as myself is that it's important to involve lived experience from idea conception to the very end, even in feedback. Even when you have like final details to put together, we are valuable from the very beginning to the very end. And I'm sure that the teams that have incorporated lived experience can attest to that, because people with lived experience are a gift that keeps on giving. I won't talk a lot about that because I will then go into a lot of details. But my second recommendation is that our stories, while fantastic, may not be the focus. I say fantastic because that's something someone told me when I told them my entire sordid story. They were like, "Oh, that's fantastic," but our lived experience stories should not be the focus. The knowledge that comes from the stories, the expert experience should be the focus of what guides. we have a lot to give that is not recounting our stories or retelling what happened to us. That's it for me, Andre. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Grace. That's fantastic. I think there's something really key about your point about involving young people from the very start. And, you know, it's never too early to involve people in research and to forge those relationships with individuals and organizations that mean you're going to reach the right people. And I think in my experience, that's the thing that a lot of researchers don't yet do. You know, we've done the work and now we want to get some lived experience views on the work, tends to be the message we often hear. So yeah, that's fantastic to start with that front and center. Thank you for joining us, and don't worry about the lack of video. We heard at the start that your connection was very flaky, so it's good to hear your voice. Sharanjit, it would be great for you now to tell us a little bit about your perspective on all of this. Over to you.
Sure thing. Cheers, Andre, and massive thank you to Grace as well. I always love hearing Grace speak about lived experience and kind of insight and knowledge. And I always learn something new every time, which I think is a really fantastic sign. So hi, everyone. My name is Sharanjit Singh. I am a lived experience consultant with the mental health priority area. And just building on what Grace said about, you know, getting young people with lived experiences and mental health challenges involved in different parts of the research stages. One of my reasons for becoming interested in research was that when I was doing more and more lived experience and mental health advocacy, particularly within racialized communities, we were always contacted to be research participants, or we were always contacted to disseminate research. And you know, I've got a bit of a background in like social sciences, so I was able to kind of look at that and think that's not really fair. You know, you're wanting to either extract, you're wanting to take our experiences and take us as data, or you're wanting us to just try and be an add-on at the end to disseminate into communities who otherwise you wouldn't be able to reach. And so that's one of the things that has really driven me into thinking around how we can best embed lived experiences and experiential knowledge across the research landscape. And so my work with Wellcome has been really varied and really diverse in terms of the work I've been involved with. And for me, it's been really important that I've been working with Wellcome to identify what things I'm interested in. And then we found within the work streams, different segments that align with my existing skills and are able to actually help me develop my skills as I want to moving forwards. So rather than, you know, I imagine it like a big jigsaw puzzle. Rather than looking at the corner of the jigsaw puzzle, we've been able to look at it more broadly and think about where I fit, rather than just trying to really put me in a single corner where I might not actually fit. And you know, this has ranged from being involved in recruitment work, like kind of going through applications, and also interviewing and asking difficult questions about lived experiences. You know, I really like to ask people, you know, what work have you done previously with you know, people who have lived experiences and mental health challenges? And then I always like to say, what was hard about that and what was easy about that? You know, because, you know, I think it's easy for us to talk about these things rhetorically, but when we actually get asked questions in a bit more depth, it can be a bit harder. So there's recruitment work. We've been working on development of different kinds of lived experience infrastructure in projects that are focusing on young people. So just because we have people in the room, just because we have people involved, how does that actually mean their involvement is taking place? Are we engaging with folks effectively? Are we engaging with folks as equals? So really thinking about not only how we conceive of lived experiences, but how we do that within the research setting. And another one that comes along with that is impact tracking. And that's something I'm particularly interested in around lived experiences. You know, just because we have the infrastructure set up, it doesn't mean that there is a mutual engagement between researchers and people with lived experiences or young people in these contexts. You know, it's thinking about how do we actually measure and understand how insights are used and the level to which insights are shaping different programs. So for me, these are some of the things I've been involved with in the mental health priority area. And I've got 3 very quick recommendations around, you know, young people's, the involvement of young people with lived experiences and mental health challenges in active ingredients work and within mental health research more widely. So the first is that little thing about the jigsaw. We might be really, really focused on this corner, and it might be slightly difficult for us to kind of look at the puzzle more widely. And so for me, it's really about working with young people to understand what skills they bring to the table and what skills they can actually try and develop in these discussions and in this work. And so that might actually involve taking a bit of a step back and looking at different parts of the research landscape and different parts of the research processes for people to get involved with that align nicely with their skills. The second part is linked slightly to that, but it's about skill sharing. So one of my questions is, if I've just been involved with some research or if I've been involved with a study, what are some of the different skills that I've learned emerging from this? These can be, skills related to, say, interviewing or like reviewing applications, but it also could be things slightly more technical if we're thinking about, data analysis, writing skills, all these different types of things. And for me, that's a key part of the equity piece. We're not just asking people, hey, come and get involved with this, we'll reimburse you in this way. We're thinking about how we can democratize and how we can ensure that these research skills are best redistributed within communities who are often kind of left out of these conversations. And finally, I think there is so much for researchers to learn from young people with lived experiences and mental health challenges, and there's so much for young people to learn from researchers. So, we're both constant students and we're constant teachers in this context. And so even just taking a couple of minutes a week to reflect on some of the things that we're thinking about, some of the impact of young people with lived experiences and mental health challenges in research is going to be so important to how we actually take this conversation forward and work towards a research culture that is more inclusive and more responsive to the people it serves. Thank you.
Fantastic. I am going to have to be careful that I don't ask people 100 questions myself, because I have now got so many questions having listened to Grace and Sharon speak. I'm sure you have as well. If you're watching this on YouTube, post in the comments, tweet us at Active Ingredients MH, your questions, your comments. If you're here in the Zoom webinar, post your questions in the Q&A, say what you think in the chat, and we will try and put those to Grace and Sharonjeet in the panel discussion later on. But for now, we're going to move on. And we're going to have our first presentation from one of the Wellcome funded researchers who completed an active ingredients project at the end of last year, Dr. Lindsay Dewar, who's a research fellow at the Institute of Global Health Innovation at Imperial College London. So Lindsay, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andre. Yeah, I'll be speaking on behalf of our team today, that includes young people. So yeah, definitions of quality social connection. So they're really mixed and often confused with the quantity of our connections. However, in context, in this context, we're actually talking about the quality of them. So really the perceived attributes of an interaction between two or more people. So really feeling part of something larger than yourself, feeling close to that other person, feeling welcome and understood. So alternatively, we can describe it as therapeutic alliance, so when undergoing therapy. But this also applies to non-formal support settings. Non-digital social connection is actually a key protective factor and mediator of outcomes across each stage of the mental health pathway. So for example, it can reduce loneliness and help lower levels of anxiety and depression, and mortality is actually reduced. Digital interventions can facilitate these connections. However, it's unknown if there's a positive effect on outcomes remain within digital. And if so, what is it that actually helps achieve this? So indeed, establishing the benefits and risk of digital interventions compared to face-to-face interactions, particularly when the human interaction is removed, is actually identified as a top research priority. So in our study, we wanted to conduct a systematic scoping review and matter analysis with embedded stakeholder and young people involvement. To really look at this in a bit more depth, so to know if the effects remain within digital interventions and what sort of digital mechanisms are going on there that helps and hinders that connection. So I'll spend a few minutes on this slide. We work together with young people with lived experience of depression and anxiety throughout the whole project. particularly around the design, review and management stage and synthesis stages. They informed the questions, the search terms, they refined the definition of social connection. We did online workshops with young people. We really honed in on sort of their views and what they felt was an indicator of social connection online. And we also really heavily worked with them in the synthesis stage. So their views are really paramount in refining our findings, what was missing. I'll talk to you about a framework in a minute, and they were absolutely crucial to helping to identify what was missing from the literature. And we did a few workshops across the project, and we kept in contact through WhatsApp group throughout the project in terms of decision making and updating any key things that were happening, constantly asking questions and in communication, which I just think is absolutely key to any research project. And we're in the process now of co-producing a zine about our findings, so a small magazine for the young person and what they would like to see. And they're also involved in the paper write-up as well. So what did we find? So we had 42 studies that actually matched our criteria for the review. And they were mainly cross-sectional studies from developed countries and primarily the USA. And they covered both treatment and prevention. Digital interventions varied, social media and apps, lots of forum-based and social networking was apparent. And we know from the literature that social connection actually throughout almost all of the studies actually improved outcomes, particularly for depression. It was also found in anxiety, but not to a lesser extent. And the digital mechanisms that actually valued throughout the literature was included the fact that you have anonymity, the peer support was really evident throughout quite a few studies. And the ease of access, you can access the internet anytime for many. On the flip side, the hindered aspects was that having this disconnect from the real world. Harassment was apparent in a couple of the studies. Some forms were unmonitored, and that was an issue, of course, for safety. And not unable to see facial expressions and body language was also really apparent. But we asked the young people about this, and in these workshops, they felt that really trust and safety and empathy were really missing from the literature, and they were really, really important. So we produced this framework that incorporated those things, and also from the literature, that's a conceptual framework for quality social connection from the digital world. And you can see here how their voice is really heard, and actually the majority are from the young people here. And some people could just have a few of them. And for example, one of our young partners actually felt that laughing and feeling happy was enough for them to feel that connection online, whereas others had a few.
You've got 1 minute, Lindsay.
Yeah, I'm just summing up. So just to sum up, so quality social connection seems to have a positive effect on in particular on depression, and our framework can be used to establish whether the social connection is present within digital interventions, aid discussions, and it can be translated into a standardized measure to be able to evaluate outcomes. There seems to be enough evidence for clinicians and developers to consider social connection when designing digital interventions. Clinicians, peers and educators should understand the importance of digital quality social connection for mental health, and new guidance and training should be considered to ensure therapies and informal social connections are not affected, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic. I just want to thank everyone in our team, Emma, Lily, Ellie Buxhall, one of our young people who was absolutely fantastic, and all of our other young people on this project. Couldn't have done it without you. It was made better because of your involvement. So I just wanted to really thank you all because you're great.
Thank you, Lindsay.
Okay.
If you could stop your screen sharing for us. Well done, that was great. And yeah, really nice to see that you've approached this from such a positive and negative perspective. You know, digital connection is obviously a key thing, especially right now. You know, with a lot of us still living in lockdown. It reminds me a lot of an event that I ran last, I think, April, which was one of my favourite webinars, just because we called it Teens, Screens and Quarantines, which is definitely the best title of a webinar that I've ever organised. It featured Amy Auburn and Pete Etchells talking about the positives and negatives of screen time in young people. I've posted the link there in the chat if anybody's interested in finding out more. Yeah, really great stuff. Thank you very much. Our next talk is one of the pre-recorded talks. So I'm just going to bring up the video for this. This is from Jacob Kraus, who's a postdoctoral researcher in Australia at the University of Sydney. And so over to you, Jacob, for the next 5 minutes.
Hi, my name is Jacob Kraus. I'm a researcher at the Brain and Mind Centre at the University of Sydney. I'd like to start by thanking Andre and the team at Mental Health, as well as Wellcome Trust for involving us in their Active Ingredients Commission. So 24-hour circadian rhythms, or body clocks, are found in almost all living organisms, and they orchestrate and organize most of our physiology and our behavior. This is a really exciting and quite hot area of research at the moment. The 2017 Nobel Prize in Medicine or Physiology was awarded to 3 circadian researchers. So body clocks are located in the brain and throughout the body, and they control many functions which are relevant to depression, such as 24-hour sleep-wake cycles, cognitive function, mood, energy, digestion, appetite. And accumulating evidence demonstrates that disturbances in the 24-hour sleep-wake cycle and the underlying circadian system are common in individuals with mood disorders such as depression, and they're also clinically meaningful. So these disturbances are assessed via a number of different types of measures, including self-report measures of sleep-wake profiles and circadian preference, so whether you're a morning type or an evening type or somewhere in the middle. Laboratory measures of physiological circadian rhythms, such as rhythms of core body temperature or the sleep hormone melatonin, and wearable technologies, so wrist-worn accelerometry like Fitbit that keeps track of your motor activity throughout the day and throughout weeks. So in this review process, we partnered with a group of 11 young people who had lived experience of mental health and sleep-wake cycle problems. And we established the Brain and Mind Centre Youth Lived Experience Working Group, which we're very excited to continue partnering with in future projects. So some of these working group members shared their stories of their mental health journeys and some of the challenges they faced. So I'll just read out some quotes from this working group. So my whole childhood, I didn't have any issues with sleep until around the end of year 11, when I really started having troubles with mental ill health. I didn't have any idea how to deal with not having a good sleep cycle by the time it started messing up. This was a common experience and really reflects the developmental changes that occur in circadian rhythms, which are normal, but can be related to depression when they go wrong. So here's another quote. I was explaining to so many doctors, I'm not sleeping or I'm sleeping all day. As the sleep got worse, whether it was too much or too little, that's when the episodes would get worse. And finally, how does sleep relate to me and my circumstance? That has never been a conversation I've had with any professional. So we're also really excited to share that one of the representatives from this working group, Sam Hockey, has written an opinion piece on our review and some of the challenges faced by young people and where they think we need to go with this research. And this will be published alongside of our review. So our review highlighted 3 key reasons which we think are really important, which support body clocks as an active ingredient of depression. So first of all, body clock dysfunction is clinically meaningful in depression. So disturbances in the 24-hour sleep-wake cycle and body clocks are common in depression, and they're linked to very important illness features such as low energy, prolonged fatigue, depressed mood, and motor activity disturbances, among others. The second key reason is that body clocks are measurable. So in our review, we provide a toolkit of sleep-wake cycle and body clock measurement instruments. Some of these are self-report, such as questionnaires which assess morningness, eveningness preferences, as well as sleep diaries. There are laboratory measures, including melatonin and core body temperature rhythms and light sensitivity assessment, and wearable technologies such as wrist-worn accelerometry or pins that track exposure to environmental light throughout the day. And the third key reason is that body clock timing can be changed with treatment. So there are behavioural and pharmacological treatments which have been shown to affect 24-hour circadian rhythms and also importantly improve symptoms of depression. So some of these strategies are behavioural, including getting bright light exposure in the morning and throughout the day and limiting light exposure in the evening, as well as getting good amounts of physical exercise and engaging in regular social activity, as well as maintaining regular sleep-wake schedules. There are also some pharmacological strategies, such as the antidepressant agomelatine, which has antidepressant effects, but also works on aspects of the circadian system, such as melatonin. And there's some evidence, albeit mostly in adults, for lithium and ketamine as also having circadian effects. So these are the three key reasons why we think body clocks are an important active ingredient of depression. And stay tuned for our review, which will be published soon. Thank you.
Great, so thank you to Jacob and the team led by Ian Hickey at the University of Sydney. Apologies for the sound issues that we had at the beginning of that talk. Hope you didn't miss too much of that. And yeah, I just wanted to kind of, I suppose reflect on the fact that sleep is suddenly a really hot topic, as Jacob said there at the beginning of his talk. Really important, the relationship between sleep and mental health particularly. And yeah, for anybody who's more interested in thinking about sleep generally and dreams also, we ran an event a few weeks ago with Russell Foster from Oxford University and Kristen Scott Thomas, the actor, where they spoke a bit about that for an hour or so. I've pasted the link again there into the chat. Really important research area, not just in young people. Okay, so moving on, our next speaker is joining us from Chennai in India, Kamala Iswaran, who is a mental health professional, a PhD researcher, and founder of the Sumanam Arts and Wellbeing Organisation. And the project that Kamala led was on arts engagement in relation to youth mental health. So yeah, over to you, Kamala. Tell us a bit about this work and explain to us how you involved young people and the findings of this review.
Great, thanks, Andre. I'm just going to share my screen now. Just a second. Great, thank you. So, has an indispensable and indisputable place in our world and in our lives. So, can art help prevent youth depression and anxiety? We began with this simple thought and asked ourselves what works, for whom, where, and how. This unfortunately was not so simple after all, and we really never imagined how much we'd have to think about. We designed a participatory insight analysis that combined an integrated review and a multimodal arts engagement with young people. As a result of the pandemic, our arts engagement had to be online. The engagement with young people began from the design process to the review, synthesis, and the dissemination. And this entire process resulted in a public arts engagement that showcased the session expressions and also a co-produced video. Our sessions themselves were strength-based and designed to create a safe space for young people to discover their own vocabularies to articulate and express their mental health needs. the sessions were spread over 2 months, and the 60 hours of guided art activities included drama, poetry, visual art, and movement. And they were tailor-made to elicit individual experiences and perspectives on living with anxiety and depression to better understand individual journeys across the entire continuum of care, from prevention and treatment to ongoing management and relapse prevention. The majority of our youth advisors had early negative experiences with mental health services and found them to be top-down and specialist-driven. They reported feeling a sense of loneliness and an inability to express themselves for fear of judgment. And in this regard, reported finding strength in the collective vulnerability of a group that came together through art. In the Indian context, the influence of caste, gender, sexuality, and particularly understanding and accepting diversity were highlighted as defining factors on mental health. They felt very strongly about redefining and renegotiating not only psychiatric diagnostic labels, but also medically driven understandings of emotion, health, and illness. Art in this context was seen as a strong way to depathologize distress and shift the focus onto the underlying structural barriers. In a nutshell, our youth advisors advocated for a holistic approach to mental health and called for early intervention that places the child or the young person at the center of the decision-making and care process. The findings from the integrated review also reinforced our youth advisor perspectives, and the current scope of evidence indicates that art interventions are feasible with predominantly positive effects on depression and anxiety amongst diverse youth populations and settings. By providing a space for reflection and sharing, both verbal and nonverbal, it helps young people with experiences of trauma. They appear to significantly improve personal psychosocial resources like self-awareness, self-efficacy, and self-esteem that helps build protective factors and enhance resilience. And there seems to be strong potential to integrate art interventions within school settings. However, we also did find that they are not appropriate as treatment interventions for young people with PTSD or for those in areas of active conflict. We also don't know how effective art interventions may be for young people with severe depression or anxiety. To gain more clarity on exactly what ingredients an art intervention should have, particularly for positive gains amongst young people with depression and anxiety, we analyzed the intervention descriptions across the 36 included studies and arrived at the list of key ingredients on the slide. The reported effect sizes from the studies that were RCTs or non-RCTs showed that the mean differences are at least 0.5 times over the pool standard deviation on scales that measured depression and anxiety, and the effects were greater on measures of psychosocial resources like self-efficacy, self-esteem, self-awareness, pro-social behavior, and subjective well-being. Our participatory insight analysis revealed that art interventions may be deployed across a range of settings, individual, family, community, and systemic. It has strong potential as a tool for prevention, as a tool for non-pharmacological early intervention. It can drive service user and lived experience expert engagement in the therapeutic process and create awareness and mitigate stigma as a result of mental health issues. They're also not specialist driven, and so in a low resource setting like India, it could prove to be highly cost effective. From a research perspective, we found the need to focus specifically on the effects of art interventions on young people with severe illness presentations and look at innovating more participatory evaluation methods that bring together a range of experts, mental health scientists, artists, and young people to ensure a more dynamic evaluation process that looks at engagement and process as much as it looks at the outcome. Our deepest gratitude to Wellcome for supporting the inquiry, the Mental Elf for having us here today, and to all our lived experience experts who were so candid and giving of their time and experiences. I will leave you with a quote from one of our youth advisors. When asked what art can do or support with, without batting an eyelid, she said, "When has art not changed the world?" Thank you. Thank you so much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kamala. Really nice. Thanks for joining us from Chennai and for sharing your work with us. That's really great talk. I'm struck by how the audience in the webinar is so diverse and so international. It's great that you're joining us from all over the place. We've got people from North and South America, from all over Africa, from Asia, from Australia, from all over Europe. I don't think we've got anybody from Antarctica, but do post in the chat if you are, because it'd be nice to get all of the continents. Wonderful. And I should just say also that if you haven't seen the active ingredients videos that all of these research teams have made, please do have a look. They're all really short, 2 or 3 minutes long. They're all made for young people, and they all summarize the 30 or so active ingredients projects that completed last year. I've posted the link there to the YouTube playlist we've got for those videos. We're still releasing them over the next few weeks, but most of them are on there. Okay, so our next talk is from Joanne Beams, who's a postdoctoral research fellow at the Black Dog Institute in Sydney, Australia. And here's Joanne's talk on effective awareness.
Hi everyone, my name's Joanne. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow and clinical psychology registrar at the Black Dog Institute in Australia. The active ingredient that my group focused on was effective awareness. Effective awareness is the ability to perceive, describe, understand, and differentiate emotions and moods. It's all about knowing how you feel. One of the reasons why we focused on effective awareness is because low or an absence of awareness has been linked to the maintenance and development of depressive symptoms in young people. For example, young people who are prone to depression are less aware of their emotions, have difficulty understanding them, and have limited capacity to tolerate them. One way to get a sense of a young person's effective awareness is by using mood monitoring through ecological momentary assessment. Using technology like smartphones, EMA requires individuals to report their feelings in real time as they go about their lives. EMA provides an indirect measure of effective awareness because an individual must be aware of, as well as label and communicate, an emotional experience in order to report that experience. There's also some evidence that EMA can change emotional experiences themselves, as well as depression symptoms. This means that EMA might act as a brief intervention with clinical outcomes, as well as being a measurement tool. In light of this background, our review had 3 main research questions. 1, can EMA increase effective awareness over time, and does this relate to depression? 2, can effective awareness, as measured through EMA, reduce depression risk and contribute to effective early intervention? And 3, what do the experts think about EMA and effective awareness? Our approach involved an integrated feedback loop that combined the empirical research literature with expert insights from young people, as well as people involved in their care, like psychologists, and other online sources like public forums. I'm only going to focus on the outcomes of the review and young people today. In terms of the review, we found 11 quantitative studies, which specifically focused on effective awareness, phone-based EMA, and depression. Of these, only 9 specifically targeted young people, with the others also including a broader adult sample. Across all these studies, the methodologies were really varied. For example, in the approaches they took to EMA, like the number of prompts they use each day or the types of emotions they were recording, but also the samples of young people, for example, whether they were clinical samples or relatively healthy samples. In terms of the experts, we involved 24 young people between the ages of 16 and 20 and asked them to become involved in various focus groups. During these groups, we asked them what they thought about effective awareness and its links to depression, as well as whether they had any experiences with mood monitoring, knowledge about EMA, and really what their preferences were. Across these young people, some self-reported a history of depression, whereas others didn't. So we were really trying to get a representative sample and insights across what different people might think. We also asked these young people what they thought or how they thought effective awareness might be linked to other processes that might be important for emotional health. Feedback from the young people really helped us to refine our search terms and to interpret the empirical literature. It also helped us to answer questions that the research couldn't, really helping to fill in some of the key knowledge gaps that I'll come to in a moment. Across all data sources, we found that effective awareness is a foundational skill that is important for mental health. In particular, insights from young people suggested that effective awareness may be linked to emotion regulation, the ability to develop and maintain healthy relationships, and even self-identity. We also found that EMA might be an effective standalone intervention. Some studies have shown that mood monitoring in real time works to decrease depressive symptoms by increasing effective awareness, with effects being potentially greater for young people with depressive symptoms. but it can also be effective as part of multi-component depression treatments such as ICBT. We also found that EMA can be used as a measurement tool to provide rich data about emotional experiences. For example, studies with EMA have found that increased variability in negative emotions could be a key risk factor for youth depression, and that real-time assessment of mood can provide important information about outcomes and course of treatment. The narrative review didn't provide much insight into the preferences of EMA, barriers to use, or even potential harms of effective awareness. The expert insights did provide some insight to fill this gap, however. For example, some young people thought that individuals that are highly motivated to monitor and who are highly conscientious might benefit most from EMA, whereas those with more severe depressive symptoms or who really identify with a mental health diagnosis might come across some harms or particularly unassisted EMA. In terms of future research, there are lots of avenues and directions to go down. Some that we suggest might be particularly fruitful are trying to create and tailor methods to monitor mood that really build on the preferences for young people. Another option might be building effective awareness programs earlier in life that can be implemented during childhood learning programs in schools. If you have any other questions about effective awareness as an active ingredient, please let me know. Don't hesitate to email me. But thank you very much for listening to my presentation today.
Many thanks to Joanne for that great talk and for joining us, even though it's the middle of the night in Australia, by pre-recording for us. That's fantastic. If you've got any questions for Joanne, she's not here to answer them live, but we can certainly put them to her. Please do post them in the chat or in the Q&A. And yeah, we really want to see your comments. We're going to have a panel discussion in a few minutes' time after a couple more talks. So please do share what you think about these talks, what you think about active ingredients in general, and any comments particularly you've got about involving young people in research that we can put to Grace and Sharon and the other researchers. Our next talk is, just 1 second, multitasking, working out how to use my computer, is from Tracy Wade, who again has pre-recorded her talk. Tracy is Professor and Director of the Arama Institute of Mental Health and Wellbeing at the Flinders University in Adelaide, Australia. And her talk is on perfectionism. And we're joined here in the webinar by Professor Ros Shafran, who will be answering questions on this talk. Ros was part of the research team. And many of you know Ros, I'm sure. Hi, Ros. She is the Chair in Translational Psychology at the UCL Great Ormond Street Institute of Child Health in London. So let's just bring up Tracy's presentation and watch that, and then we can see what we think.
Hello, my name is Tracy Wade, and I am one of the investigators on the Perfectionism project as an active ingredient in anxiety and depression and youth. I'd like to acknowledge the work of my co-investigators, Sarah and Ros, also our research assistants and the Wellcome Trust for the funding, and the contributions from people with lived experience. The background here, really, we start with the definition of perfectionism, which is important to get common ground because there's so many different definitions and so many misunderstandings. So Ros, Sarah and I have been working in the area for quite a time now, and this is the definition that we work from. When someone's self-worth is based on meeting their consistently and at times unrealistically high standards and expectations, despite negative consequences. The negative consequences can include depression, anxiety, and eating disorders, and also things like avoidance, procrastination, overchecking, comparing yourself to other people, and it starts, of course, to impact on social relationships as well. But perfectionism is also associated with a range of positive beliefs about achievement and productivity. So people are quite ambivalent about changing perfectionism because they perceive both the bad and the good. Now, fortunately, we know that we can decrease perfectionism using cognitive behaviour therapy, and it also decreases depression, anxiety, and disordered eating. And we have done those evaluations in face-to-face and online formats. But we do know that these interventions could be better, and we know that perfectionism is linearly increasing in youth over the last 20 years. So it's particularly important that we make them better for young people. And so we were very interested to find out how young people could make these interventions. So we had two components of our research. We synthesised qualitative research on perfectionism in participants with a mean age of 24 years. There were 37 eligible studies featuring the voice of lived experience, and we looked at 6 identified themes across those studies. We also conducted a realist synthesis of information about perfectionism on websites, and we identified common themes and helpful strategies. We found 266 websites, 7 themes related to informational aspects of perfectionism, and 15 helpful strategies were identified. We then invited our research advisory group, 18 young people aged 18 to 24, to comment on these themes, to talk about what resonated with them, what were the gaps, what was missing. To do that, we conducted first an online survey to get that information, and then we followed that up with an online group discussion in a Mentimeter format so that people could develop their ideas more in discussion. Okay, in terms of our findings, I want to first of all direct you to what we would call the vicious cycle here. And this is sort of what seemed to map on to both the literature and the voice of lived experience. And you'll see that there are writing in italics in each box, and that's the actual quote from someone with a lived experience of perfectionism. So if you start with perfectionism, people setting unrealistic high standards. So for example, I must always do the best in the class on an assignment. A half effort isn't good enough. They have to work relentlessly, do it 100%, or it's just no good. And that also means a lot of organisation. That leads to anxiety, trying to meet these expectations and standards. And the more that you're trying, the more you worry about making a mistake and making it happen. And of course, depression, because everyone knows that perfection is almost always impossible to achieve. So people are often disappointed in their performance. And that leads to lowered self-esteem, increased self-criticism. And so people think, well, how will I feel better? I can make myself feel better through going back and striving and achieving more. If I can just nail it this time, if I can just do it this time. So people get caught up in that cycle. So the research did indeed, it confirmed that close link between perfectionism and depression and anxiety. And it also very much helped us to understand that so far there's been very little inclusion of lived experience in informing the development of interventions, that the websites at the moment with information currently contain very little helpful practical advice, and the tug between those benefits and costs of perfectionism do impede interventions. And young people really emphasise the importance of support networks for that treatment journey, that this was a really difficult thing to do on one's own. Thank you for your time.
Great, and thank you to Tracy for the presentation and for sharing that with us. Really good to involve that work and to weave it into the webinar today. And our final presentation, before we stop and have a small group discussion, is going to be from Dr. Izzy Bray, who's Associate Head of Department for Research and Knowledge Exchange at the University of the West of England in Bristol in the UK. And as you can see, Izzy's team worked on green space in relation to youth anxiety and mental health. Over to you, Izzy.
Thank you. So, firstly, thank you to the Wellcome Trust for funding our work. Our active ingredient was exposure to green space. We combined evidence from a wide range of disciplines and study designs with insights from young people to answer this question: in which ways, in which contexts, and for whom does exposure to green space reduce the risk of anxiety and depression among young people aged 14 to 24 living in urban settings? We sought to understand causal mechanisms as well as to quantify effectiveness. Just trying to move on my slide.
Sure, no problem.
Any tips? The arrows aren't working.
You might have to click on it and you might not be active. Feel free to stop.
There we go. Brilliant. Okay. So with the help of people in Health West of England, we involved young people with lived experience of anxiety or depression at 3 stages of our project. There were 2 panels according to age group. The search terms for our systematic review were informed by an early conversation about what aspects of being in green or natural environments the young people found particularly helpful. This influenced the scope of our review. For example, should we include activities that involve contact with animals, or should we include blue spaces? Later, when we were piecing together the evidence and building a conceptual model, I showed this to the young people who confirmed links based on their own experience, both those for which we had found evidence in the literature and hypothesized links, which helped us to fill in the gaps. Their insights revealed that it is as much what is absent in green spaces as what is present that provides restoration. For example, observational studies look at the presence of vegetation and trees. Intervention studies evaluate activities that take place in green spaces. But young people said that it was the absence of social media and traffic that allowed them to relax in green spaces, as well as the presence of nature. For some, it was the activity, such as horse riding, that meant they couldn't engage with social media. And I chose this photo to illustrate the experience of a girl in Bristol who said that she didn't particularly like being outside, but that when she used to live in Cornwall, she would go pier jumping with her friends. What she was describing was a feeling of trepidation followed by the sensation of freezing cold water, which meant you were really in the moment. We should be providing similarly challenging and exciting experiences for all young people, wherever they live. Finally, the 19 to 24-year-olds recorded clips of themselves in green spaces, talking about their own experiences to illustrate our main findings. These clips were then edited into a vlog aimed at young people, which is what Andre mentioned earlier. We felt that this coming from peers would be more effective than coming from the researchers. So, our findings. We synthesised evidence from 47 papers, and this is our conceptual model. Features of green space are on the left-hand side, and psychological outcomes are on the right-hand side. We used evidence from the literature to build up the processes in the middle. In the bottom left, exposure to forests and parks has been linked to mood and state anxiety. The width of the lines reflects that these were experimental studies. Thinner lines represent evidence from observational studies. Above that, we have particular aspects of being in green spaces, like scenes of nature or sounds of nature, which have also been related to restorative qualities, mood and relaxation, based on experimental studies. Top left, you can see exposure to vegetation, and the evidence here comes from an existing systematic review, which included adolescents and young people up to the age of 25. This provides good quality evidence that exposure to vegetation is related to reduced risk of behavioural problems mediated by social interaction and physical activity. Other longitudinal studies provide links of exposure to vegetation and GHQ12, and these are mediated by physical activity and restorative qualities. They included the variables rumination, resilience, and mindfulness, which were helpful in understanding the psychological processes that link green spaces to symptoms of anxiety and depression. Studies of physical activity in green spaces provided links to mood and sleep. Then we added some hypothesized links, which are shown here as dotted lines. These were discussed with the panels of young people. For example, we think that better sleep leads to better mood. The young people agreed with that. More social interaction is likely to lead to better social cohesion, which is known to protect against depression. So this process has helped us to make links to the outcomes of interest, which were anxiety disorders and depression, that were previously weak. Obviously, further work is needed to test these hypothesized links. Since green space clearly underpins so many of the active ingredients that have been studied, it's really important that we protect and promote access to green spaces for young people in urban areas, now more than ever before, as well as providing opportunities to experience natural environments outside of the city. Thank you so much for listening. Very happy to take any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Izzy. Really nice. Feel free to stop sharing your screen now, and we'll have the Q&A. So if all the panelists can now turn on their cameras, and we will start answering some questions. And I guess I wanted to start with just a really broad question, because it strikes me that we've kind of created this slightly unhelpful division and almost reinforced it a bit during this webinar between people with lived experience and researchers. You know, we started off by saying, oh, aren't we brilliant? We've got people with lived experience here in this webinar, you know, aren't we great? But we had them, Grace and Sharon there at the start, clearly defined as the people with lived experience. And then we had the academic researchers talking about their work. And it strikes me that that division and that barrier that we create, whether that's conscious or not, is unhelpful. And as a number of the talks have mentioned, ultimately what we're looking for here is research that involves people in a really meaningful way. You know, we need to have service user-led research or survivor-led research. You know, a lot of the researchers here in the room have got experience of mental illness, I'm sure. I certainly do myself. So why are we still reinforcing this unhelpful division? Who would like to talk to that and some of the solutions that we might be able to present here? Ros?
I just want to say I couldn't agree with you more. I think that certainly in some of our PPI groups, they have amazing research expertise. And I think to pigeonhole anybody as having just one area of expertise when they may have multiple areas of expertise is unhelpful. But that does have to be balanced against researchers thinking that they don't need people who have particular expertise with lived experience. And I think pigeonholing is unhelpful, but equally recognizing people's strengths and range of experiences, regardless of how they happen to have entered the research project, is critical.
Thank you. Yeah, Lindsay, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of echo that, but also add, I think a lot of what we're trying to do is bring into not just meaningful patient and public involvement, but into co-production. That's certainly what we're striving for at Imperial. And I think that's about obviously co-producing everything from the start and all the way through the research project, but having that equal power and that equal skills are, just given and received, and learning is shared, and it's this whole sharing decision making all the way through. Because I've certainly learned so much from the young people, and we're also then providing training back for the young people so that they can have that new skill and then be able to lead in the future. And we were really lucky in another project to actually be able to break down those barriers even more by having like a temporary contract within Imperial, so that they could have access to an email address and have shared folders and things like that. So again, breaking down those barriers that distinguishes you from someone with lived experience, when we're both gaining these research skills, we've both got lived experience. And I think it's just about looking at innovative ways to break down those barriers as much as possible.
Yeah, Sharon, you just made a really interesting comment there in the chat. Do you want to build on that a little bit?
Yeah, so I just mentioned that this goes down to a hierarchy of knowledge that has developed over centuries. Since the Enlightenment, we pride kind of quote unquote empirical knowledge, things that are rational and things that are detached from subjectivity, and things that we see as objective in kind of quote unquote air quotes. And so when we're talking about experiential knowledge, when we're talking about people with lived experiences and mental health challenges, that it almost presents a bit of a tension, because this is seen as something that is derived from someone's subjective experiences of whatever they've experienced. And so it's almost a bit of a challenge to how how we conceive of knowledge within research and how we conceive of legitimate knowledge. And so you have, in some spaces, you have that prioritizing of, clinical knowledge, academic knowledge, because it is seen as legitimate, because it's seen as kind of objective. Whereas lived experience related insights and knowledge can be seen as slightly lesser, even though we might say ourselves lived experience is really important, it's valuable, but there is still some tension there between that and other knowledge that is seen as academic and clinical. And so I think from my side, it's kind of, there's a lot of internal work that needs to be, a lot of internal questions that need to be asked by people within academic, like kind of traditionally academic spaces and researcher roles about, how are we valuing, people with lived experiences and their knowledge and their insight, rather than kind of, we can talk about it until the cows come home, right? But how are we actually working to bring these knowledges together at a level playing field, rather than still seeing one as higher than the other.
So I'm interested in what the researchers think about what needs to change from a research funder's perspective to be able to do this better. And did these active ingredients projects that you've just completed ask you to involve young people in a different way to how you've previously been asked? Is this forging a new approach? Who would like to come in on that?
I would just say that because of the way the funder asked us to do the work, that encouraged us to do it, and that was fantastic. So yeah, I think we need more funding calls like that. Yeah, Lindsay?
Do you want to go, Raz? Sorry.
No, you go first.
I was just going to say, just to echo that on with Izzy, I think all research funded projects that, particularly in the mental health space, because I think we're kind of ahead of the game in a little bit, that it should always be, your project is working together on this subject, and it's not just a, we've come a bit further from a tick box exercise, but there's still an area to state, blah, blah, blah. This is how you're going to involve people with lived experience, when it should be the overarching project should always be a given that that's what's going to happen. And just to go back to the review itself, this project, I think, particularly with a systematic review, I think that was new for me. I worked with young people with lived experience in the first stage before on a review, but not all the way through. And I think it was fantastic working with Ellie on the data extraction and with Lily in partnership. It just really helped refine everything. She knows more than we do. I just think it was the way it's going to be from now on. So yeah, sorry, I could talk all day about this. So
I wanted also to ask Kamala what your normal way of working is, and whether working on this active ingredients project and the way that you involved young people was different to how you would normally have worked.
Thank you so much for the question, Andre. Interestingly, it wasn't very different for us because we're very much an implementation organization. And this was actually one of the first few research commissions that we've worked on. And my own background is also in implementation. So our work and our process is actually very closely intertwined with working with lived experience experts. So beginning from the conceptualization of the idea to the entire program rollout, whether it's our therapy service or our work with children in schools or the work that we do in workplaces, everything is intertwined with the perspective of the lived experience expert and done from the end user perspective. So it wasn't very different for us, but it was very challenging because we had to switch the modality, and that was something we'd never done before, because all of our engagements so far had always been in person and physical. And so it was suddenly really challenging to have to do movement online, and to have to, kind of teach theater skills online and work that way. So that was very different and very challenging for us. But I think it helped to be on the implementation side for once.
Thank you. Yeah, Roz?
So I think there's quite a lot of variation between the funders and also internationally. So I think the UK is actually leading in a lot of ways in co-production. And I think some funding agencies like NIHR have been fantastic in setting fees and appropriate budgets that has come up in the chats. Where I think we really are lacking is in things like journal publications. So we tried to get we wrote a paper and had our people with lived experience as co-applicants, as co-authors. And the first thing, you have to enter everybody's email address. Well, people may not want their personal email addresses out there in the public, but that was a barrier, and that was an insurmountable barrier for the journals who couldn't overcome that. And then the reviews that came back were something that are very familiar if you're used to academia, but if you're really talking about somebody's lived experience and somebody else, some objective reviewer is being very dismissive of that, it's inappropriate, I would say. So I think that it's all the way through. If we're really going to have equality, then it needs to be equality from inception to dissemination and implementation as well.
Yeah. Thank you. I think it's a really important point, and echoed by Rose McCabe. Hi, Rose, who's saying in the comments, there's a tension between co-production and the outcomes that are valued compared to more conventional hard outcomes deemed important by reviewers or decision makers. Yeah, this is a kind of systemic problem, isn't it, that we need to address. So I also wonder, before we move on to Kat's talk in just a couple of minutes, I also wonder if you could all reflect on the other barrier, which is between different areas of research. We do tend to still work in silos, don't we? And obviously mental health science is only really going to move forward if we work across disciplines. And a lot of these areas, I'm thinking particularly, Izzy, your Green Space project, obviously involves very diverse groups of researchers, environmentalists and, I don't know, town planners, or as well as psychologists and psychiatrists, etc., etc. How do we do more of this kind of mental health science where we break down those barriers between the kind of mental health research silos?
I'll go first, I guess. Well, I think one of the things that's helpful is that we all understand mental health, even if we're not psychiatrists. Everybody, whatever their job, has an understanding now and is able to talk about mental health. So our team was a psychologist, and myself, I'm from public health, and then somebody who describes herself as an environmental scientist who works in green infrastructure. So we were really varied. But I think it works if you're all happy to, if you're interested in other people's work and you're happy to try and learn from other disciplines. And I suppose that's the prerequisite, isn't it? And meet people halfway. And I felt that as public health, I was kind of in the middle of that team, and sort of linking together the two other sides that were quite far apart, maybe. But yes, I think for us, that was really interesting. It worked well. And I think it's a real benefit in terms of dissemination as well. So when I presented this work recently to some psychiatrists, they were all saying, well, we completely agree, this is really good, but are the planners listening? Is government listening? And I was able to say, well, it's really good because one of my co-researchers works with planners, and she runs a research centre for sustainable planning. And so she's being asked to do talks more for that sort of audience. So yes, I think that we are reaching the policymakers we want to because of the breadth of our team. It's no good just psychologists or just psychiatrists working together and disseminating in their own journals. We need to be disseminating in a broad range of journals academically, and also, of course, beyond that.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Thank you. It's time to move on now. So I'm going to give the floor over to Kat Sebastian, who's the evidence lead for mental health priority area at Wellcome. Over to you, Kat, to tell us about the 2021 active ingredients.
Thanks, Andre, and thanks so much to all our teams and to Grace and Sharon for fantastic presentations. I think really showcased what's quite special about the Active Ingredients Commission, in that we have brought together researchers from really disparate disciplines and involved young people with lived experience and learned something new about the state of the science. So I'm really happy to announce the launch of our second Active Ingredients Commission for 2021. And what we're looking for is, here we go. We're looking to fund up to 20 additional active ingredients reviews. So in our first commission, we funded 30 teams to look at 26 active ingredients. And each team reviewed the data on one single active ingredient that they thought made the most difference in preventing or intervening to reduce symptoms of anxiety and depression in 14 to 24-year-olds. But of course, that list of 26 wasn't an exhaustive list, and we never intended it to be an exhaustive list. And what we want to do this time is to add to that list of 26 to get an even richer picture of what are the key factors that really make the difference for youth anxiety and depression. Just to give a bit of background on this idea of active ingredients, we like this metaphor of active ingredients, and we have developed this further into a sort of cooking metaphor to make the point that everyone's recipe for improving mental health will be different. And what we want to do is understand the evidence behind the constituent building blocks or ingredients that go into each person's recipe. So we are funding teams with up to £45,000 per project to review single active ingredients. We're interested in a huge range of factors. So I think one of the questions was, are we only interested in ingredients or factors that an individual can do or control? Absolutely not. We're interested in all ingredients from cellular. For example, in our last commission, we looked at SSRI antidepressants, we looked at circadian rhythms, right up to societal. So urban planning for green spaces, things like cash transfer programs. Anything is in scope, not just psychology and psychiatry. And as before, we're really interested in ensuring that lived experience is brought into every project that we fund. So what are we looking for? Active ingredients not included in the 2020 commission. So we really want to build on our current list. I've put a table up here, and this is also in our current request for proposals, so that you can ensure that your proposed active ingredient isn't already covered here. We're looking for rigorous reviews, so we're looking for secondary research. Primary research is out of scope, and we want to answer the question, what works, for whom, in what context, and why? And this was something that I think in the first commission, there was a lot of research out there on what works, maybe less so about what context and why. So it's helpful for us to know what the state of the evidence is to help us plan our future research programs. As mentioned, inclusion of lived experience throughout the proposals is crucial. And we're looking for a diversity of ingredients, so as I mentioned, across disciplines, but also career stages, geographies. We're particularly interested in encouraging people to apply who maybe haven't applied to Wellcome before, particularly interested in reaching researchers from low and middle income countries. We have an intention to fund at least 5 from low and middle income countries. And we're also interested in supporting early career researchers. So in our last commission, we did have leads who were PhD students, postdocs, early career researchers. And So we're committed to supporting early career researchers both as leads or on teams. Just put up here a few key dates. I won't go through them all, but end of this week is a key date because we're interested in hearing any questions that you may have. We've had some great ones in the chat. We've tried to answer them on the fly, but some of them we will take away and report back. And we'll also take some of the questions that you've asked, even if we have answered them, and add them to our FAQ document if people don't mind, just so that everyone can benefit from the answers. It's a two-stage proposal. So the 8th of March is the submission deadline for a brief expression of interest. We appreciate that's fairly soon, but at this stage, we're only asking for 300 words. Then we will inform suppliers late March whether we would like them to submit a full proposal deadline end of April, and then we will be hoping to notify successful suppliers by the end of May. So thanks very much to you, the audience, for your attention, and also to all our teams and lived experience advisors, and to Andre for hosting us today.
Thanks, Kat. So we've got a few minutes left. If you've got any questions now for Kat, do please post those in the Q&A or in the chat. We've got a question coming in asking about specific subpopulations, Kat. So is it possible to look at key ingredients for specific subpopulations? For example, girls between 14 to 24 or 14 to 20-year-olds with learning disabilities, or does it need to have a universal applicability in terms of treatment and prevention?
Yes, we would say you can look at subpopulations as long as a rule of thumb, if the interventions would be predicted to affect around 10 million or more young people worldwide. So if you think your subpopulation encompasses a population of 10 million or more, or can make the case that it would, then that's absolutely fine.
Thank you. We're also, we've got a great question from Duncan in the chat asking about the number of people with lived experience being included. Is there a kind of ideal number of young people that you'd be looking for these reviewers to include?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think we specified a particular number. I think most teams usually had a sort of advisory group, although it really varied from team to team. I think what we would say is more than the number of people, it's the way in which they're consulted. So ideally, a strong proposal would include the voice of young people with lived experience throughout the process. So right from the planning stage through to implementation and then reporting, rather than, for example, just convening a focus group and saying, here's what we found.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Question from Jane Lewis in the chat. Would an active ingredient that focuses on a specific approach to delivery be within scope? So she's thinking about delivery by peer or lay people, for example.
Yes, I think that would be in scope if it was specified sort of clearly and discreetly. So for example, I'm thinking of Lindsay's presentation on quality social connection delivered digitally. I think if you can make the case that that's a kind of discrete ingredient that differs from another means of delivery, that would be within scope.
Okay. Technical question from Rena Dutta. Could Kat say a little more about the funding being a contract rather than a grant, please?
Yeah, so one of the reasons that we decided to run this as a contract rather than a grant is that the deliverables or outputs that we want from the contract are so specific. So, you know, we're commissioning a specific review paper on a specific topic, and we also include within the contract things like monthly meetings, attending lived experience workshops, And these are the things that really make the Commission work, to bring people together to do things in a slightly different way. But on the other hand, it's a little more prescriptive than usually goes with the grant model. So I think that's the key reason for it being a commission rather than a grant. Okay,
thank you. Good point from Avantika in the chat about the stage at which we involve young people. And obviously Grace and Sharon G are very much saying, you know, at the beginning. So have previous researchers included young people at this proposal stage? How is it possible to do that?
Yes, it's absolutely possible and encouraged to do that. Last time we had some people included a lived experience advisor as one of the team members. So you can have up to 3 named team members. Others put them as named consultants on the application and were able to and costed their time into the proposal. Others recruited the young people afterwards, but included a budget for their time. And that reminds me of another question that came up in the chat, which was, were young people reimbursed? And yes, we would always encourage teams to reimburse their young people. And when we look at the justification of resources, we do look at the budget for involvement.
Then a couple of questions here about what we mean by an active ingredient. So the first is from Belinda Platt, and it's, is it preferable to focus specifically on prevention of depression rather than prevention and treatment of depression and anxiety?
So I think that is for the researcher to decide, and it will vary depending on the state of the evidence for that particular ingredient. So, you know, for some, if it's a vast, sprawling research field, then it might make for a better review paper to focus in. For others, you might not have enough research. This is something that happened in the first commission. People, you know, planned one way and then realized actually there wasn't as much research as they thought that fit the scope, and then broadened out the scope. So I would say try and be as specific in your application as to what you want to look at, and justify that on the basis of the evidence that's out there. And it is absolutely fine if you want to look across prevention and intervention. Often there's no sort of clear line between them. Similarly, between anxiety and depression, obviously there's a lot of co-occurrence of symptoms and diagnoses. So if it makes more sense in your field to look across, then we would welcome that.
Great, okay. And now from Kanika Malik, who's asking, does the active ingredient need to be a specific component, or can it be a non-specific skill that's used across interventions?
So I think there is definitely a grey area in what is defined as an active ingredient, and that's something that we have talked about quite a lot with across the research teams and within ourselves. I think a specific skill would be fine if it's quite discrete and related to a sort of mechanism of action. So for example, thinking about effective awareness, for example, that feeds into a lot of different skills in different facets of someone's life, but is nonetheless kind of definable as a discrete skill. So I would say, yes, that specific example is fine. And we have had ingredients like that in the 2020 Commission.
Okay, great. And we're nearly out of time, but one more question from Ishu Kataria, who's asking about whether the expression of interest can be a collaboration between different research organisations.
Yes, absolutely. And we would encourage people to work across institutions and across disciplines and across geographies. Just to note, though, that the contract would be made with the lead organisation only.
Does that organisation have to be a university, or can it be a charity or other organisations?
It can be another organisation as long as they can contract work with the UK.
Okay. Brilliant. Thank you for all the questions, everyone. We're out of time, I'm afraid. So, Kat, if you could stop sharing your slides just for the last couple of minutes. We are going to capture all of the chat and all of the questions and all of the slides and all the videos and everything, and we are going to share that with everybody afterwards. So don't worry if you struggled to follow everything, or if your question didn't get answered, we will try and contact you afterwards. And yeah, just a few thanks to finish off. I just wanted to really find out, first of all, what you all thought of this, because this is a kind of unusual event for us in that we're talking about a new research call, and we're also talking about disseminating research. If you had to recommend this sort of webinar to a friend or colleague, would you? So 1 is not very much and 10 is a lot. Just tell us what you think of what we've done. Thank you. And then we promise we won't send you a survey after the webinar. That will be it done, that one question. And while you're doing that, I just wanted to thank everybody for being involved. Thank you very much to our amazing panelists, to Grace, to Sharanjit, Lindsay, Kamala, Izzy and Roz for joining us in person. And of course to Tracy and Jacob and Joanne for recording their talks in advance. Many thanks, everyone. And thanks also to the Wellcome team, especially to Kat for presenting the new call. Great stuff. Thank you to my colleague Laura, who has been doing some fantastic live tweeting today. If you're on Twitter, have a look back at the hashtag #ActiveIngredientsMH and do get involved in that discussion. And so this is good news for us. We've got a fairly positive response to the webinar, so that's fantastic. And 1 or 2 people who didn't like it quite so much. So feel free to email us or tweet us and tell us why you didn't like it quite so much or why you absolutely loved it. And we're out of time now, so I'm going to say goodbye from everyone here in the webinar and see you all again soon. Thank you.